and it does appear as if I am live. Hello, everybody. I do hope that people can hear me. It has been a fairly considerable amount of time and several restarts since I have used only barely serviceable, and as always, I am left at a complete mystery as to whether or not it is actually working properly. Hopefully soon enough I will be able to see some commentary in the chat that tells me that everything is working properly and that my beautiful voice is being conveyed to you effectively. It has been quite a long time since I have actually streamed, and to be honest, I've been very distracted by real life. It has been quite complicated for me recently. We've had quite a few things going on, particularly as the year has slowly gotten better and better in terms of the weather. I have spent most of my time outside, and I have been enjoying myself immensely outside. I have been doing a great deal of gardening, and that has been very, very pleasurable. I have been dealing with 30-year-old ivy, which... Actually, let me rephrase that a tiny bit. I wouldn't really call it pleasurable so much as I would call it satisfying. There's something very, very pleasant about being able to just reach up and cut back against something that has been there since probably long before you were born, and exerting your control over nature in that way, and freeing up plants that haven't seen the light of day in years and years and years. That's been very, very pleasurable, but it has also been rather physically painful to do, because it turns out that ivy roots are extremely tough, and when you're cutting through them with unpowered secateurs, then you have a tendency to start to develop rather significant pain in your fingers and hands, especially after you've been doing it for 2 hours and have been shifting about 5 or 6 different bucket loads, or wheelbarrowfuls of stuff. That was very unpleasant. Although, overall, I'd say that I've been having a very good time. It's been very pleasurable. But it has kept me away from the computer a fair amount, and goodness me, a lot of stuff has been happening recently. A lot of stuff in the YouTube sphere, a lot of stuff in the VTuber sphere, but in all honesty, I feel more like doing something like this, because... goodness me, I'm just looking back at the Discord. Oh my goodness, what on earth is this insanity that Murray has unleashed upon us? That is so horrifyingly ugly. I just don't understand how any kind of corporation... I won't even show it on stream because it's actually physically repulsive to me. But it's this weird corporation with some of the ugliest models I've ever seen. There's this goth cat girl thing with 3 eyes. There's this Dullahan VTuber, and there's this thing with giant claws and breasts that look like you could use them to smother an ox. That's very, very distressing, to be honest. Very disturbing, and I'm not going to stare at it any longer, yeah. Very, very, very horrifying, and I'm very glad they're in a language that I have no idea with, and I have no idea why anybody has brought them up. It is very, very distressing to see. Actually, let me just ask. You even discussing these things, they are absolutely horrifying. Oh dear. My chat, my community does dig up the most interesting things to pull from the abyss and plant in front of my face. I really don't like it. It's very upsetting to me. Anyway, I'm just going to give a quick explanation of what I'm going to do, because the format for this whole thing that I'm going to start is quite simple. I am going to read this book chapter by chapter, And I'm going to take extensive notes on. Hello, Justin T, by the way. Nice to see you. And those notes will be the summary that I will display as we go through. I do have these books all downloaded directly to my computer, so I will just switch over to gaming for a second. And as you can see, the book itself will be displayed. Let me just monkey around with my OBS settings, because I have to kind of monkey around with things just to make sure that you can see everything on the screen. There we go. This is slightly more awkward than it normally is. You can see the book cover right on the thumbnail for this video, and that is Evil, Inside Violence and Cruelty by Roy F. Baumeister. I have no idea if I am pronouncing his name correctly. Ironically, I intended to look up the pronunciation of this guy's name before I started stream, and then I forgot because I realized it had been so long since I had last streamed that I needed to go back and I needed to log into all of my accounts again. So that was very fun and very much irritating. Why on earth? There we go. I have no idea how it goes. Proctor gets filtered in top chat mode. Apparently, how it goes proc is considered a very dangerous and disturbing message by YouTube, and therefore it is decided that it shall not be shown unless you go to live chat. That's just a little bit strange to me, but then again, YouTube is as YouTube does. But yes, you will be able to see the actual book on the screen as I go through it. What you will not be able to see is the very extensive set of notes that I have taken that I will be referring to. A fairly large amount of the stream will be me reading these particular notes, but for the most part I will be giving fairly extensive off-the-cuff commentary as well, particularly when I notice something that may be interesting or otherwise worthy of note, and hopefully the whole experience will be decently informative for people. And hopefully another thing that I plan later on is to do more scripted content style reviews of these books when I've gotten sufficiently far into them, so that these summaries become even more accessible and available, because a few weeks ago, I was sitting back and I was thinking about what direction I really wanted to take this channel in and everything, and evidence has shown to me that I just do not enjoy doing VTuber drama-style content or even information, because as I've unfortunately learned to my own detriment, the way this whole industry works, it's very difficult to remain objective in any reasonable capacity, and it's very annoying to me to have to deal with all of the drama and all of the nonsense that goes around with it. I tried to be as empirical as possible, and well, you can't really be empirical in the entertainment industry, and I'm tired of people trying to take me for a ride, and I'm tired of trying to straddle the line on giving my opinion versus giving objectivity. Because at the end of the day, who the hell knows in 90% of these cases? The number of people that are willing to peddle absolute lies and nonsense for views is stratospheric. And it just bothers me on a moral level, because I always like to stick to the facts as much as possible, and I like to feel as if I can walk away from a topic being honest. And I just don't have that ability when it comes to the VTuber industry. The things that I want to be honest about are the things that people desperately want me to keep quiet about, and the things that I could lie about if I wanted to lie about. I mean, you know, it's what everybody else has already lied about. I don't like that kind of environment, but this kind of thing, this kind of analysis is much more up my alleyway, and I'm also going to be starting to stream a lot earlier than normal. I'm planning to do at least one stream each week. There might be two occasionally, but I'm not too sure about that. Monday, definitely. Wednesday, potentially. We will see. And I might start doing more TVA-focused content when it comes time to split up and reorganize the forum in March. But until then, I'm mostly just going to relax and focus on this personal pet project of literary analysis of mine. And hopefully people either watching live or watching the VOD later on, or maybe even potentially the scripted video, why on earth did that go out of my head for like 5 minutes, will be able to enjoy it and gain a new appreciation for the literature that I will be going through. And I also just want to note for the record that if anybody would like a copy of the books that I'm going to be reading, I have all of the PDFs and everything, and you can just ask me on Discord or over somewhere like the forum in via DMs, and I will more than happily slip a copy into your inbox for future enjoyment. So now, give me a moment or two to have a drink of my water. Ah, that's nice. Oh, actually, I forgot to add the honey to that, so that is rather tart, but that's okay, that's perfectly fine. It's better for me that way. So this whole book, well, that first chapter kind of answers what the point is. And this man, Roy F. Baumeister, is a professional psychologist, and his entire book is essentially about evil. In particular, it's evil from an analysis point of a psychologist, and it's from an empirical perspective, because, as he notes many times throughout the book, an empirical analysis of evil has many opposers, because people want to stereotype evil on a constant basis, whether it's religiously, whether it is morally. The simple answer is that most people don't really want to think about what motivates people to do what they themselves see as evil acts, but which the perpetrator may not indeed see as evil, which I found an inherently very interesting concept, and therefore it's why I chose to start reading through this book. And as a preface, I just downloaded it almost on a whim because I saw it recommended on a Twitter post, and I was extremely tired, and I planned to just take a glance through it before I went to bed, and so I loaded it up on my laptop. And about an hour later, I realized that I had gotten 2 chapters deep, and it was only by that point that I started to seriously feel so tired that I couldn't physically continue reading. And it's because this book spoke to me on a very personal level, because I realized very quickly that it was conceptualizing and putting into words an awful lot of the things that I had thought in the past in my own personal analysis of why people do certain things, and it was presenting them from a position of authority, because again, this is a professional psychologist that has produced this work, and he also has done several studies to help back up his work, and draws very extensively from physical examples of evil and criminal activities in an effort to explain them. And in the preface to this book, which I won't go over just now, he comments that one of the main pieces of feedback his beta readers gave him when he presented them with copies of the novel prior to publication, or copies of the book prior to publication, because this is not a novel, my apologies for that terminology error, is that he was going to piss off literally everyone by publishing this book. He was going to piss off both liberals and conservatives. And my general opinion is that if you manage to piss off both sides of the political spectrum, you're probably doing something right. Not in a kind of enlightened centrist style way, but in a very much kind of follow the evidence where it leads, as opposed to wherever your personal ideological fallacies would like it to lead. That is where I think the pissing off both sides comes from. But yes, within the first chapter, The first chapter sets the tone for the book extremely well, because it most certainly delves into topics that will annoy both progressives and conservatives, which is very, very good. So, I will, without any further ado, really get into this. I've only been chatting for just 16 minutes, but that's not really too long. Why can I hear a very weird noise whenever I move my mouse around the screen? No, this is what it works. This is what it works. So anyway, let us begin. Allow me to just organize my tabs, because I've only just started to realize that I need at least 3 screens, and it's very irritating. I only have 2 screens at the moment, so we have the PDF on one, we have my notes on the other, and we can switch over to the screen. This is the first time I've ever used multiple different windows in OBS active at once, so give me just 1 second while I make absolutely certain that everything looks perfect by going to my own video. I'll just mute my audio for 5 seconds. Hello, Dicato. Nice to see you, by the way. Just give me a moment. Yes, everything looks very good. Nice. Nice. Good. I was quite worried when I set this up. I was a bit... Oh, actually, let me just move that. There we go. Now we look just about perfect. So we can get started right away. I'm not able to view the chat very easily. So if anybody comments something and I might be a short while until I answer you, I do apologize that, because I have to choose between looking at the live stream and also looking at the notes that I've taken. So without further ado, let's get into it. So we start off with the chapter 1, which is the question of evil and the answers. I have done my best to highlight all of the points that I think are particularly interesting. You can see them, the green highlighting. I do apologize to any colorblind viewers, but hopefully you can still tell what the highlighting is. And the critical points I've highlighted slightly darker than the regular green. The unhighlighted parts are worthy of reflection as well, but for the most part I've tried to make these as summaries rather than literally just me reading every single part. And as we start out, just in the first couple of paragraphs, Baumeister makes a couple of initial assertions, and his first assertion is that evil enters the world unrecognized by those who let it in. His second assertion is that most evil people, or at least those that are described as evil by bystanders, do not themselves see themselves as evil. And 3 follows on from 2. Evil is in the eye of the beholder, and the beholder is usually the victim. And 4 is somewhat controversial, I would say. Without victims, there would be no evil. Victims of evil often embark on quests for a meaningful explanation. And that's because evil challenges our basic perception that most people are good, and that the world is basically a nice place to live in. Now, that's essential for the functioning of society. But evil causes people to question their beliefs, and it also results in mental scarring. And that's why evil needs to be explained. As you can see here, yes, evil challenges some of our most basic and important assumptions about the world. I also like this comment here. The great thinker St. Thomas Aquinas wrote that the existence of evil in the world is the single greatest obstacle to Christian faith and doctrine. After all, how can God allow evil to happen? Which I personally find very interesting, being a practicing Christian myself. He also comments on the social sciences as well. More recently, studies by social scientists have emphasized that most people in modern Western society go through life with strong positive beliefs that the world is basically a nice place in which to live, that life is mostly fair, and that they are good people who deserve to have good things happen to them. And he makes the point these beliefs are a valuable aid to happy, healthy functioning. On the other side, suffering and victimization undermine these beliefs and make it hard to go on living together happily or effectively in society. And I think you only just need to turn on the radio to see some great examples of this. One moment. Zuli, might I recommend doing Notes from Underground next? Sell me on Notes from Underground. What's it about? But I think that right away, just in this second page alone, you can see how this book was published in 2020, by the way, so it is quite a recent publication, and we have seen in the last couple of decades how in Western society there has been this climate of discontent and the feeling that, well, basically the world is not so much of a nice place and that life most definitely is not fair. But I think that most people would still agree that good people deserve to have good things happen to them. And I think especially in an awful lot of quarters, there's this impression that those who are still attempting to do good are not having good things happen to them. The system has been rigged to the point where you are no longer, in essence, receiving good karma for the good karma you do unto others. And the results of this are pretty obvious. Although Baumeister is here describing things such as rape or robbery, he points out that the psychological scarring can last for many years. But most importantly, a characteristic of these scars is that the victims lose faith in their basic beliefs about the world as fair and benevolent, or even in themselves as good people, and so evil strikes at people's fundamental beliefs. And this is a critical compound of this whole book that I really enjoy, because in modern society especially, as people have lost their sense of moral propriety, as they've lost their understanding of what it is to be good and evil. Because if you ask any 5 people what is good and what is evil, you're likely to get 5 different answers. However, I would say that there would be a decent number of similar themes between those 5 different answers. And those themes have been under attack in the last 20 years or 30 years, or even longer depending on how far you want to go back in time. And they've been under attack in very specific ways. There is, of course, the idea of things like racial guilt, especially in the West, that white people are evil, or that certain other classes of people are inherently oppressed by our existence. And also, of course, that the foundations of our moral behavior have been based upon something evil and twisted because, Christianity can't be good because, Christians allowed slavery to exist and all this kind of nonsense. So it's our... This sentence, thus evil strikes at people's fundamental beliefs, is incredibly valid in multiple ways, and it's one of the first sentences of this book that really struck with me and resonated to me. And Baumeister outlines the value of this book here. He's trying to give a casual answer. He won't try and defend or justify the existence of evil, but merely to explain how it happens to come into the world. And this I greatly respect, because an awful lot of the problem with modern moralization, like as a Christian, I have a belief about what evil is and why evil exists and how evil influences the world. But although I believe those explanations are true and valid, I am also aware that they can sometimes be quite obscure and quite esoteric, and that they make it hard for people. Like, for example, I believe in the existence of Satan. I believe that Satan is active in the world, and I believe that he causes evil. But that isn't particularly very useful to somebody that has just experienced a robbery. I can't walk up to that person and say to them, "Hi, you were robbed because Satan is evil and he inspired that robber to do evil," because that's probably not true. Whereas this book is very much on the practical side of things, in that it puts forward numerous theories and valuable explanations as to the cause and effect of evil. It does so in a practical way that I think is very helpful to people. It gives logical arguments for its points, which I appreciate. And very often I found that even psychologists tend to have a dogma, but the writer of this book, Baumeister, he seems to have avoided dogma in as many ways as he possibly can, which I tremendously respect. But I want to go into this first illustration as well. He uses illustrations very frequently throughout the book, and this is one of the rare ones where I believe that it's fictional, because I have heard variations on this a great deal, and I'm not going to read all of it because it is fairly long. All of this pink highlighting is examples, by the way. It's the illustrations or the stories or the... No, I wouldn't even call them stories, because he stresses later on that he tries very hard to make his points, to base his points in reality and not use metaphors. So I think this is one of the very few illustrations that he uses. All the rest are actual examples of things that happened. But this particular illustration can be summed up fairly easily. Is that in this classic illustration, a woman purchases a bag of chips at an airport, and then she sits down with it at the table of a middle-aged gentleman. But to her shock, he reacts to her first bite of the chips by taking one of them for himself. Without exchanging a word, they end up taking turns at the bag until there are none left, and the woman leaves in shock that he had the audacity to steal half of her food without a word. But the twist at the end of this is that she discovers that her chips that she bought are still in her bag, and she was the one that had been accidentally stealing his chips all along. And it's a fairly simple illustration, but the reason that Baumeister gives this illustration is that it's to illustrate the third point that he made previously, that evil is in the eye of the beholder. Individual perceptions of evil are often contradictory. Self-reflection or additional context is often needed for perpetrators to realize the evil that they have done. It also illustrates the first point and shows that evil often enters the world in a manner unobserved by those who are opening the door to it. Magdalenus Rex, welcome by the way. Oh, that's good. I assumed this stream would intersect with my uni classes tonight. What did I miss? I can't tell when you sent that message, but you probably haven't missed much. I've only just started. And Zuli also, I've not read it personally, but from what I've gathered for an overview of it, telling the bad of nihilism and the impact of it on society by the perspective of the underground man. 5 seconds ago. Okay. So you've only missed a tiny bit, and you can catch it on relay. Give me just 1 second, because I want to take a screenshot of Zuli's comment for later. Doing notes from underground next. Allow me to just place that in my personal Discord. I will be reopening stream material later on, just to allow people to give me links to further things to review. I have far too many channels in my personal Discord. There we go. That'll have to do for now. There we go. The author was writing it just before the Bolshevik Revolution as well, and taking what he was seeing around them to build off it. The author is... Oh, Dostoevsky. Nice. I have not read much of Dostoevsky before, but I have heard very good things about him, so... I will most certainly look that up. Thank you for that recommendation. Anyway, let us continue. He points out here, if there was evil present at that table, it was not glimpsed by the perpetrators, it was only recognized by the victims. This discrepancy is very common even with genuine and serious evil. He points out the woman herself was the one who acted outrageously, and yet she was the one that was horrified that anyone would do something like take someone else's food at an airport. The challenge of this book is to understand how perpetrators come to do things that others see as evil. Because in this case, the woman took the chips, she placed them on the table, she thought they were hers, and so she began eating them. But the reality of the situation was that she was actually stealing from the other man the entire time. And so despite the fact that she thought that she was the one being wronged, he was in fact the one who was being wronged the entire time, and it wasn't until later on that she realized what she had done. And we'll see a pattern like this emerging many, many times in the future illustrations, not so much in this chapter, although there are a couple of instances of it, but in the second chapter especially, this illustration comes back in a very big way, and that was the point when I realized I desperately needed to actually make a video series about this book. So let us continue. Another point he makes here is that if you had asked the woman if she would ever take a stranger's food at an airport restaurant, she would definitely have said no. The same question would have likely elicited the same response to almost anything about evil. And he expands this out to, would you obey orders to kill innocent civilians? Would you help torture someone? Would you stand by passively while the secret police hauled your neighbors off to concentration camps? Thing is, if you ask people these kind of questions in isolation, most of them will say no, but the reality is that we live in a society where we have borne witness to dozens, if not hundreds, probably thousands of such events, and people have just not lived up to those kind of promises. They have not lived up to the promise to be decent and good in all situations. And this is where he makes a very good point. Understanding evil begins with the realization that we ourselves are capable of doing many of these things. The airport story hints at two core aspects of evil. The first is the infliction of harm by one person on another. The second aspect is chaos. It's the violation of the friendly, orderly, comprehensible world. And going back to what I was saying a little bit earlier, the violation of the friendly, orderly, comprehensible world is something that I think has crushed the hopes and aspirations of a tremendous number of people in present-day situations. People have been brought up and raised with the idea that society is a good place to live and that their needs will be taken care of if they apply themselves to, say, having a job or starting a family, and yet they are confronted when they go out into the world, when they grow up, or even as children, they're confronted by chaos. They are taught that there is an orderly, comprehensible world out there, but then they look out at society and they go, well, where the hell is it? I've been lied to almost from the time that I can start walking. And I think that has been a chief subject of the demoralization of people in these days, how you can get to the point where people, even when they're given the opportunity of something better, they have become so jaded and so miserable that they won't take it. And it's something I think that Kirsha, I'm going to bring up the Foxwoman, I'm afraid, that she struggles with a great deal, is that in a lot of her streams, she talks about the demoralization of people around her, that she can encourage them as much as possible, but rather than take heart, they will not just ignore her advice or her suggestions, they will also try and drag her down to their level just so that they do not have to hear any longer the idea that things could be better than what they are. And that's another motivation that I have as well, to try and talk about these kind of issues too, because I think it's incredibly important to continue to push for positivity, even in a very unpositive environment, but not just empty positivity, but positivity that actually means something. And I think exploring these kinds of topics in an objective fashion is very important. As a result, am I late to the lecture? No, you're only about 20 minutes late. Magdalenus Rex, the Milgram experiment was debunked, but it is spiritually ever true. I do agree. Magdalenus Rex, not particularly related, but I finished Dragon Quest Roman numerals, and the whole game is basically one massive motivator to endure the worst of life and get a family. Almost feels like a pronatal psyop based. The only thing I know about Dragon Quest is I watched a couple of clips of, wasn't it Usada Picora? Or other Hololive members. Isn't it that one with the incredibly addictive gambling mechanics that the Hololive members were completely and totally hooked on? That's all I know about Dragon Quest, I'm afraid. But I mentioned near the start of the stream, or the start of this commentary, that Baumeister says that he pisses off both the left and the right a great deal in this book, and Dragon Quest V, by the way, thank you very much, Zule. And we're about to get into one of those. This is because this isn't just a dry and empirical analysis. It's also quite funny in a lot of rather entertaining ways. And we're about to get into one of those rather entertaining points right now. DQ5 literally has the title Bride of Heaven. That's cute. Can't wait for the gambling Zatsu stream. I'm a Christian. I don't gamble. It's against my religion. Like, seriously, my church forbids gambling. So what is evil? I'm going to read this illustration verbatim simply because I find it extremely funny. At one point, my wife and I discussed the possibility of adopting a child. Ever since my experience living in a foreign country with a local family, I have been enthusiastic about diversity in families. My wife and I discovered that we both favored adopting a black child. We are both white, highly educated, and financially comfortable, and we thought we could give a child a very good head start in life. We thought that bringing up a privileged, well-educated black child might be of more value to society than rearing a privileged, well-educated white one. Okay, Fortunately, our discussions of adoption never moved beyond vague speculation. I say fortunately, because to many people, it would have been supremely evil for us to adopt a black child. Indeed, the National Association of Black Social Workers declared that the adoption of black babies by white parents is a form of genocide. My wife and I would have been led by our seemingly innocent idealism into such an atrocity. We thought of it as lavishing love and a few advantages on a child who might turn out to help society and heal racial differences, though. Some people, though, would regard us as no different from the folks who stand out in the blood-stained and foul-smelling fields, holding machine guns or machetes, methodically killing long lines of people simply because of the ethnic group to which they belong. I think you can understand why I read that out loud verbatim. That's kind of strange. I wonder what he would think like that about black people's intellect. Oh, we'll get into that. We'll get into that. This chapter immediately jumps into the pissing off both sides part, and we'll get into that very soon. Ah. Hello, Armored Glass Cannon, by the way. Nice to see you. Yeah, also, Magdalenus Rex, for the record, I mentioned earlier I will be streaming at an earlier time from now on because I have classes in the morning on a Tuesday that I have to go to at like 8:30 a.m. And yeah, staying up till 1 to 2 a.m. to stream and then taking like an hour to go to sleep, it doesn't work very well. So yeah, I'll be going to bed at an earlier time from this. I hope to have this stream about 2 hours or so. So we'll see about that. Let me go back to my notes for a second. And as my notes point out, though Baumeister does not necessarily agree with the National Black Social Workers assessment that a white couple adopting a black child is an act of genocide, he uses this illustration to further hammer home the point that evil is a matter of perception, to the point that a seemingly good act can be condemned as a monstrous one by another. This can be seen across a host of examples, and includes spree killers who say they have done nothing wrong, or lawyers who view acts of rape as the result of a lack of TV access. And yeah, you can see that in this part right here. Consider the act of raping an 11-year-old girl, which most people would regard as evil. Such a rape was committed recently by a 14-year-old boy, whose lawyer saw no evil. They were two kids with nothing better to do. They don't have cable TV. What do you do? I'm just going to let that hang in the air for a second. And as he also points out here, even something as seemingly unambiguous as genocide has a very contested definition. So his point is, if it's so hard for people to agree on what a genocide even is, how hard is it to find a universal definition of evil itself? And this is also something you see a great deal in modern society as well, the dilution of the idea of evil or destructive forces. The term has an air of anachronism, especially as belief in Satan fades from our culture. According to the Oxford English Dictionary, people hardly use the word evil anymore in everyday conversation, and when they do, they are often mocked. This presents an increasing issue as time goes by. As Baumeister points out, words like evil and bad have constantly changing meanings that rely heavily on context. And like in the modern era, the word bad is often used positively with sarcasm or not, and you very much see that in certain communities. The dissolution of language. Magdalene Rex says, evil is a lack of negation of good in theology. I buy that the most. Yeah. You have to remember this guy is a psychologist. He is very, very secular in his mindset. I mentioned before, I don't agree with him necessarily on the concept that evil is entirely physical, but I think that from a physical perspective, his approach is very, very good. Communist governments are most assuredly evil, given they constantly parade Luciferian rejection of the good. I mean, dialectical materialism as a whole is basically the negation of the real. He's a psychologist, WTF. The word baddie comes to mind. Yeah, I know, exactly. That's exactly the kind of thing. And this is another thing that is very common in the whole progressive circle, is that you take words that used to have solid meanings and you turn them into words that have ambiguous meanings. And because of the ambiguity of the meaning, then the word becomes diluted. I love the power glove. It's so bad. Hello, Kenneth Patterson, by the way. Nice to see you. Yeah, exactly. It's very irritating, especially to somebody like me, and it's another reason why an autistic person like myself enjoys this book, because Baumeister, this whole book is really honing in on a definition, which I enjoy, because I very much am in favor of definitions being as exact and precise as possible. I hate ambiguity in all of its forms. Let us continue. He says, in this book, I will use a broad and inclusive definition of evil. The one major restriction is that we are concerned here with evil acts by human beings. And I've written in my notes that he will exclude natural disasters and other similar nebulous phenomena to focus on individual acts of violence, cruelty, and pettiness. The book will focus on the prototypes of human evil, aka intentional harm. Now, Baumeister does stress that this leaves a lot of many grey areas, but there is a tangible distinction between harm as a physical experience and harm in relation to the psychological interplay between perpetrator and victim. In the end, Baumeister's guideline remains that evil is judged in the eye of the beholder, which includes the perspective of the dispassionate bystander. He also excludes the idea of insanity as an explanation for evil, because, in his opinion, as a psychologist, madness is a very rare phenomena. You can have people that are unhinged, you can have people that are just not particularly all there in the head, but I would agree with him on this point that insanity is a very underwhelming and negative way to explain evil. It's far too easy and far too dismissive. Sorry, I'm gonna belch. 1 second. Oh, pardon me. Now, social scientists generally agree that there are certain universal factors behind crimes, and studying common everyday offenses often helps give insight into the motives behind serial killers, and this assumption is constantly tested against evidence and is not considered ironclad, but Baumeister again stresses that it's an effective approach when used effectively. As he points here, there is immense heuristic value in including everyday offenses in this investigation because more is known about them, because, after all, you can't really interview serial killers and mass murderers on a regular basis. I think the occurrence of serial killers in the general population is something like 0.01% at most. No, I do not want to update that software. Please go away. Thank you very much. And this is another thing that I like about the book greatly, is that Baumeister constantly tests his assumptions against the evidence, which I appreciate. Magdalena's Rex points out, the only case of insanity I can legitimately buy was Kip Kinkel. I don't know who Kip Kinkel is, and let me just look that up just briefly. 1998 Thurston High School shooting. A 15-year-old freshman student named Kipland Kinkel. Honestly, having a name as terrible as Kipland Kinkel is almost enough of a justification for an act of massive violence as I can ever think of. He killed his own parents. Well, again, with a name like that, I can understand having some justifiable rage against your parents. Increasingly aberrant behavior, heightened fascination with weapons and death. Major depressive disorder. He was additionally diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia and began taking antipsychotic medication. Currently incarcerated at Oregon State Correctional Institution in Salem. Interesting. It's a very grisly subject, but also a very, very interesting one. What does Rinfriend said, what does insanity mean anyway? An unrealistic, illogical view of the world, a weak and disturbed mind, list goes on. I mean, insanity is basically whatever society defines it as. So insanity is defined basically what the majority of society defines insanity as, and it's again why I don't consider it a good explanation for evil either. But we start moving now into the subheadings once more with feeling. My notes actually get a bit more coherent as we go along, and this is we had a funny story before. It's not going to be particularly funny, unfortunately. Now, Baumeister uses this illustration to stress the point that while some murders and other violent acts are committed under intense emotional turmoil, most aren't. And this particular illustration here in the pink highlighting, I'll read the summary here. During the Indian Wars of 1864, soldiers tasked with exterminating an Indian village encounter a fleeing child of no more than 3 years of age. Rather than show any empathy for the boy, the soldiers turn it into an impromptu competition of who can shoot the boy dead as he flees. The winner is, of course, praised for his superior marksmanship. And as he points out, it's natural to react with sadness and disapproval of this story, but one is especially shocked at the attitude of the soldiers. Now, the problem is there's no reason to think that these soldiers that engaged in the killing of this little boy were psychopaths. They were probably normal, average American men like many others, and they saw their actions as ordinary. They were barely worthy of comment, despite the fact they were murdering an innocent 3-year-old, and indeed they were doing so in a way of showmanship. But the question is why, and the answers can be found a lot in their surroundings. I mean, as the script points out, the men were hardened killers and they were used to their work. Killing is very psychologically difficult, and I recall reading in depth once that the average, I think, 0.3% of the average population are psychologically capable of committing murder. That's what psychologists generally think, that out of the entire human population, only about 0.3% of people are able to commit the act of murder without extensive preparation, training, and justification. But obviously, these soldiers were professional killers, and they took professional pride in their job. And he stresses that another critical factor is, let me just scroll down to get it, yes. They were preoccupied with the marksmanship competition because all 3 of them took turns trying to shoot this boy, and it was the one that scored the hit that was considered the best shot. People can get used to killing and it produces less of a reaction, but they recontextualized the act into one they found easier to deal with as well. Take the scene out of context. There were 3 people standing together, and one of them shot a 3-year-old boy to death, and he was the winner. The others would have to concede his superior performance. They had fired and missed, whereas he had scored. We will see that egotism is an important and pervasive cause of evil. Egotism usually causes evil people... Egotism usually causes evil because people strike out at those who insult, criticize, or humiliate them. Surely they were just following orders. That is also something that is pointed out later on, but in this case, Baumeister doesn't touch on it too much. In the midst of moral outrage, we can be further shocked that the soldiers will be preoccupied with winning a little informal competition amongst themselves. But I propose that such an attitude is actually quite an important way that people cope with performing such actions. Because perpetrators, when they're sensitive, often suffer nightmares, anxiety attacks, debilitating guilt, gastrointestinal problems, and many other signs of stress. So perpetrators are better off if they are not sensitive. Now, these were soldiers, so they had obviously already committed violent acts against other groups, and additional context, of course, is that they were tasked with the extermination of the entire Indian village, which included all of the women and children. This would have been just a job to them like any other, and it's a very common factor in a lot of these mass killings, is that once people... It's like the whole... I remember a scene in Casino Royale, which is like a reboot of the Bond franchise from many years ago, where one of the first scenes is because 007 is given his license to kill, and he shoots a man, but before he shoots the man says, it gets easier after the first one, and then Bond shoots him, and he says just afterwards, yeah, it does. And it reminds me also of how the Soviet Union motivated its soldiers to fight back against the Germans, even though they were suffering horrific casualties and they had lost nearly all of their military equipment. They set up the decimation system, and the decimation system was that in a battalion that had suffered a defeat or had run away or escaped, one man would be selected at random, and the other 10 men in his unit would be asked to kill him, and they would beat him to death with sticks or pelt him with rocks and kill him that way. And the idea was that the men would all be made culpable in the execution of their comrade. And once you've made somebody culpable in an act like that, their spirit becomes broken in a way that makes them much more compliant and able to internalize and justify similar acts of violence against other people. And these soldiers that had been forced to kill their own friends, their own comrades, people they'd sometimes spent years fighting alongside, they often went on to become extremely effective shock troopers for the Red Army and were basically the bulwark against Nazi aggression throughout most of 1943 and 1944 before Russia finally took the offensive again. Now, that screams extreme desperation to kill their own soldiers running away. I mean, the whole Soviet war effort is a fascinating subject that I really enjoy. Well, I don't enjoy looking at it because it's bloody terrifying and very, very miserable, but it is very interesting to look into. The psychology of the Soviet Union is, I would say, quite mandatory learning for anyone who wants to realize the end kind of moral state that progressives in current year are trying to push on society. Anyway, let's get into something a bit more psychological here, which I really enjoy. Well, again, when I say enjoy, I enjoy this intellectually. I don't enjoy this in terms of the actual material. I don't enjoy reading about examples of people murdering each other and so on, but the psychology behind it is quite fascinating to me. So this illustration is once more quite long, and I will summarize it. This is about a boy called Cody. And the summary is here. A teenage gang member is caught between a life of crime and caring for his pregnant girlfriend. On the day she goes into labor, he promises to visit her in hospital. To get to the hospital, he steals a car, but rather than take the direct route to the hospital, he instead detours into a nearby neighborhood. Here he encounters a dangerous rival. For several minutes, he carefully contemplates his options, whether to go straight and prioritize his new baby, or further his gang career by killing his criminal rival. In the end, he chooses the latter and shoots the man dead before casually driving home to relax and watch a movie, abandoning his pregnant girlfriend in the hospital. Now, would you like to play, chat, would you like to play a game of Guess the Race in this particular illustration that I've just summarized for you? I'm sure you can guess, but it does spell it out later on. Anyway, let me get back to my summary. Now, this story of this young man, Cody, illustrates many violent people often have very complicated and conflicted thoughts prior to committing evil, but afterwards they engage in trivial pursuits instead of meaningful contemplation or remorse. Because when Cody was really struggling between the choice between escaping the gang life and caring for his girlfriend in society, or the violent, destructive attitude of gang life, gang warfare, murdering other people, and living, as it says here, a dangerous, violent life outside the law. In the end, of course, he chose the violent lifestyle, but the methodology behind his choice is quite interesting. Oh, sorry. Oh, just 1 second. Sorry, I've got a lump caught in my throat. Just a moment. And Baumeister points out that this underscores that evil not only involves the individual, but it also involves a general aversion to the idea of order, harmony, and the assumption that when given the choice, most people will choose to do good rather than bad. Because the illustration of Cody is given to underscore the fact that this young man didn't need to choose the way that he did. He had the option to go straight, basically, but he chose intentionally to do evil. And why did he do that? Despite the fact that it wasn't an impulsive crime. And it contrasts it here with the soldiers in the previous example, too. Sorry, I'm just being beeped. I just realized I have not put on streamer mode. I do apologize. Again, that's what happens when you don't... when you don't stream for like weeks at a time. You start forgetting all your settings. There we go. Unlike the soldiers in the previous example who could excuse their actions with the tried and true just following orders line, Cody had every opportunity to simply walk away from his situation. Furthermore, his thought process indicated an awareness of this act. Before committing murder, he was standing at a crossroads. On the one hand was a chance to become, if not a respectable citizen, then at least have a semblance of a normal life. On the other was the seductive chaos of gang life. Now, Baumeister states that Cody committed his crime accidentally on purpose. Though he was considering going straight, he was also performing actions that gave him an excuse to do what he wanted to do, which was to seek out a rival and murder him. He did not deliberately take the detour in order to seek out that rival, but he did choose to put himself in a situation where such an opportunity would present itself. When that obligingly did, Cody used it as an excuse to let go of his self-control and indulge in his worst impulses. Now, the book makes a very interesting point here. Let me just scroll down a bit. Yeah, this is page 14. And this is something that I also put out on Twitter because I found it very interesting. Maslow's hierarchy of needs with murder at the base. Ducato, I'm guessing black, yes. Yes, indeed. He is indeed black. Indeed. After reviewing the general causes of evil, one might ask, why isn't there more of it? Many claim that exposure to violence promotes violence via imitation or desensitization. But if that's true, given the amount of violent media that people are exposed to in society, why isn't it the norm? Why aren't people more violent? And the given explanation is that self-control is an essential moderating force for one's darker impulses. Most people don't actually need reasons to be violent. You just need to take away their reasons not to be violent. Now, Cody Scott's example gives us a chance to look at the nature versus nurture debate when it comes to analysing the causes of violence in society. And I find this particularly interesting, and once again, this ties back into the whole pissing off both sides thing. Cody Scott's crime showcases elements of both. Before his prison stay, as we can see here, violence had been extremely common in this area. However, when he escaped from prison, or rather he was released from prison, my apologies, he found that most of the gangs had stopped fighting. Why had they stopped fighting? Well, it's quite simple. There was crack cocaine on the market now. Now, it's really entertaining to think of the addition of crack cocaine into a black society leading to less violence. But the fact is that the drugs were a very profitable business opportunity, and so violent shootouts over things like bank robberies and petty crimes that the gangs were fighting over previously just kind of dried up. And so he was no longer in that situation that he was originally. Let me scroll down a little bit further. And so as the book highlights, a change in the structure of economic opportunity led to a substantial reduction in violent instances. It does not take much thought to realize that to these young black men, selling drugs is simply the latest form of American bootstrap capitalism. Scott's memoir claims that many black youths feel excluded from the American dream, and drug peddling is one of the few markets he argues they can excel at. His book contains many anecdotes about his violent lifestyle, which was supported primarily by his young male friends. Indeed, violent behavior is almost the exclusive purview of young men, and if anybody out there has ever read certain statistics on the violent offense rates of men who make a certain claim about their gender, and this is especially entertaining. Overwhelming evidence suggests that men are naturally more violent than women, regardless of their environment or circumstances. Thus, Baumeister confidently asserts that while environmental factors can influence aggressive behavior, they can't eliminate them. And I think that is something that we can all agree with as well. And as Rin Friend says, I don't think violence in media ever compares to real violence, especially the feeling of doing it yourself. That's also why it doesn't influence us into it. It's just not the same. I would argue there is a certain level of desensitization involved because on a personal level, I have grown up in an extremely sheltered environment because my family is devoutly religious. I mean, I'm pretty devoutly religious too, but because I grew up with the internet and they didn't, my immediate family and the older members of my community are very, very sheltered, and they are very, very innocent. They are, in fact, I would say they are incredibly innocent by modern standards, and I'm often incredibly surprised by the things they find shocking and offensive, because those same things are not shocking and offensive to me in any way. It's like quite a few of them won't, but they won't watch the news because they find the violent, for example, footage of like bombings or explosions that they see on TV will actually traumatize them. They can't watch it because it'll give them nightmares. They are that innocent as to the level of violence in society. And so I don't think that exposure to media violence... I'll just bring my microphone close to my face if it's cutting off, I apologize. I don't think that exposure to media violence causes people to be more violent, but I do think that it primes people to be more expecting of violence. Let me just check. Red square. I'll just give it a moment and see if stream comes back. I'll just check my messages quickly. Why on earth is my control panel like this? There we go. Let me just reorder my OBS control panel, actually. Is Oshi passed on the red square onto him? Yeah, now disregard me. It's all good after refreshing. Yeah, if the stream ever does lag or anything like that, just refresh and see if that works from it. Okay, I think we're good. If we're good, then I'll move on. Okay, let me get back to my work. But yes, as I was saying beforehand, the case is I do believe that media violence can desensitize people to the idea of violence in society, that they will naturally become more inured to it, which I don't necessarily think is a bad thing, because I think there is such a thing as destructive innocence, where you're so innocent that any level of exposure to violence basically cripples you. It's like fainting at the sight of blood. It's a bit like how doctors score very high in the psychopathy tests for psychopathy, because to be something like a bone doctor, for example, you need to have a very, very strong tolerance for, well, blood and gore. It takes a very detached mental persona to take a steel blade and slice through somebody's flesh and then grind a saw through their bones to cut their bones apart. So, yeah, I don't think people should be entirely innocent, but I do think that society as a whole would be better off being a bit more innocent about violence than it is. I've seen the extremes on both ends, and I do think there's a happy middle ground, which, you know, hopefully maybe one day we'll manage. Anyway, yes. He points out just in this last part, aggression is probably a product of the interaction of nature and nurture. The universality of some patterns, such as young male aggressiveness, suggests that nature has programmed aggression to be more pronounced in some groups than in others. Yet aggression and violence seem to be quite sensitive to many factors in the social environment. Changing the environment will probably not be enough to eliminate a violence completely, but it can increase or decrease it and can channel it into particular patterns. The net effect on local mayhem could be substantial. By the same token, aggression does not erupt randomly as a product of inner forces and processes, but occurs in certain situations and is a meaningful response to them. Rin friend, that sounds really interesting. I am in fact heavily desensitized to disgusting things thanks to the internet, and I often don't even realize it. Regular people aren't like that. I mean, yeah, it's just like when I first started using the internet, like the picture of a bum, like a backside just on its own, would be like, "Ugh!" But now I can be confronted with pretty hardcore stuff and be like, yeah, that exists. It's not that I want to see it, it's just that I've seen enough of it that my brain is not gonna go inherently ugh very much at it. Some ortho bros considered a high art like a sculpture. Hello, Adam. How on earth do I pronounce your name? Adamelek? Adamelek? You're going to have to get used to me being completely incapable of pronouncing the average name, by the way. I do apologize. Anyway, let's get back into the whole pissing off both sides part, because, yeah, this next example is very, very interesting. It's another fairly long one. Actually, no, it's not. It's fairly short. But I'll leave it on screen for now. In 1994, a white woman in South Carolina named Susan Smith claims that her car was stolen at gunpoint by a black man who drove off with her 2 young sons still trapped in the passenger seats. However, despite a massive hunt, neither the car nor the man or either of the children are found. In the end, Susan confesses she made the entire thing up, and actually, she drove the car into a lake with her sons asleep in it, drowning both of them. To the surprise of nobody, she was given a quick trial and then sentenced to life in prison. A lovely, fun, happy case. Like, there are some funny illustrations in this book, others are really, really depressing and miserable. Just Ada? Okay. Zuli, I know there's a word for it, but it's not at the top of my head, basically, because it's basically an empathy drain of always having something to be empathetic about, be it sick puppies, weather disasters, or even crime. Yeah, I completely agree with you. I think that it's dangerous. In fact, that's a good point. I think that it's dangerous to be so exposed to things that you go from being inured to it to losing empathy over it. That's the dangerous part. It's like how people can get to the point where they see somebody drowning and rather than try and help them, they'll just film it for Instagram. Like that, I think, is the point where you have to ask yourself, yeah, I think people have been trained, have learned a few wrong things, and we need to go back. Now, Baumeister uses this, but going back to this illustration here, Baumeister uses this tragic and very disturbing story to illustrate how the news media often discusses dramatic, unusual crimes, but also happens to neglect statistically common ones. And as a result of it, his book is going to focus mostly on actual causes of violent acts and how people's inherent assumptions about evil can differ from reality. And the Susan Smith story illustrates quite a few of these popular myths of evil as a random, inexplicable force that rips apart the peaceful lives of ordinary people. And in this case, it was a complete stranger from out of town who just barged in, threatened a young, innocent mother, and stole her children right in front of her. And also, because it was the South, of course, by calling him a black man, Susan played into the natural tendency of the white people around her to assume that evil could only come from outside of their community. Unfortunately, Baumeister also notes that, statistically speaking, interracial crime is a lot less common than crimes committed within racial groups. And if anybody knows any FBI statistics, yeah, that's definitely true. There's far more black-on-black crime and also white-on-white crime committed than interracial crimes. There's plenty of interracial crimes that do happen, I'm not downplaying that, but in terms of absolute numbers, you're far more likely to be killed or murdered by a member of your own race than you are by a member of any other race in most circumstances, okay? Most circumstances. There are exceptions, I know. But basically, Susan's story was exactly the kind of formless, stereotypical evil from an outside source that the people around her were most likely to receive, without question. People much more readily see foreigners or people who are different from themselves as evil as compared to their relatively slow acknowledgement of evil among their own group. Her story would have been more plausible on a statistical basis if she had invented a white perpetrator instead of a black one. That is, a white perpetrator might have had more resemblance to actual crime, but having a perpetrator from a different race increased the resemblance to the popular, deeply rooted myth of evil. And as Baumeister points out in these last two sections here, thanks to these inherent assumptions, it is often difficult to get a clear empirical insight on the nature of evil. Stereotypes perpetuated by media and fiction create biases and distort reality, which is why the author concludes the section by stating he will be relying as much as possible on true stories following forwards, which is a decision that I agree with. Unfortunately true, Proctor. Yep, I know, it's very depressing. And this next section is one which I also posted on Twitter as well. I will be doing that in future, by the way. I'll be taking a couple of sections of each chapter that I read out, and I am going to be posting them on Twitter just as a kind of teaser of what I will be reviewing. Have a little sippy sip. There we go. The magnitude of evil. Now, this section begins with the following claim. A central fact about evil is the discrepancy between the importance of the act to the perpetrator and to the victim. Now, Baumeister calls this the magnitude gap, and that is, victims of evil almost always place more importance on their situation than does the perpetrator. He illustrates this with the rather charming case of a man who was convicted of molesting several dozen children. Now, after his conviction, this charming old fellow expressed the desire to move on with his life, and, golly me, he even apologized publicly to his victims and asked to be forgiven. Now, rather understandably, the apology was rejected, and his victims and their families were insistent that he stay firmly behind bars. This is a typical difference between perpetrators and victims. The perpetrator draws fleeting pleasure from an act, but the victim suffers lasting consequences. When brought to justice, the perpetrator often struggles to grasp the magnitude of their crime, looking instead for ways to minimize its mental impact and avoid responsibility for it. The magnitude gap is also reflected in different time perspectives. Oppression, violence, and cruelty fade much faster into the distant past for the perpetrator than for the victim. And here's the part that I think really drew me into this book as well, because moral outrage is a central factor of modern media. We all know it and we all see it. We see it both on the left and on the right, don't we? I think we can all agree. There are some things that we look at. I think it's reasonable to say that most of my audience is overall right-leaning, and we look out onto the far left, we look at communism and so on, and we say, our instinct from our experiences generally is, goodness me, those people are insane. They can't possibly believe they're doing this right. What they're doing is horrible. We must moralize about this. And that's protective on one hand, but it can also be very difficult, make it very easy for us to stereotype people. But Baumeister does his best to avoid this, and this is something that he admits to having problems with. Because he says, on the one hand, he's a researcher who's looking for data and pursuing it to empirical conclusions. But on the other, and I respect him for acknowledging this, he's a human being, and is as emotionally reactive to the subject matter as the reader. Now, he takes his pains to explain that he's not trying to excuse evildoers of their actions, but he's merely trying to understand them. He states that while the victim's perspective is essential for the moral evaluation of an act, it is ruinous from the practical evaluation. As he says, the main goal of this book is psychological understanding, not moral analysis. It will be necessary for me to tune out the overwhelmingly powerful victim's perspective to understand the perpetrators, and it will be necessary for you, the reader, to do so as well, which is very hard often. And I respect him for taking this stance, because it's difficult, and it's complicated, and it's painful, and it goes against human nature. There we go. Which draws us to the next section. Now, it's very closely intertwined, the next two examples, because this is entitled A Pair of Hate Crimes, and yeah, it's fairly long and complicated, but I've summarized both of the examples that he gives here, which I will read out now. Now, the first example, which you can see here mostly on screen right now, is that in 1919 in Omaha, Nebraska, a 19-year-old white woman claimed to have been raped by a black man named Will Brown. This was considered the latest in a string of similar attacks, and as a result, a white lynch mob formed outside the courthouse where Will was being held. In the ensuing riot, Will was shot over 1,000 times, and his body was burned to a crisp. In a later HBO documentary, the presenter erroneously described the mob as smiling happily while watching Will's body burn on its makeshift pyre. Now, in the second example, which is detailed quite a lot further down the page, is a perpetrator's memoir, similar to Cody Scott's example previously, discusses an act of violence he participated in as a young black man against random white victims. And in this particular example, he details how he and his friends ambushed a white cyclist and savagely beat him into unconsciousness. Now, the highlight point that Baumeister is using here is he's asking an important question that he poses to the reader, and he points it out here. In a word, is sadism a cause for evil? Yeah, Zuli says it's hard to ignore stereotypes when they prove it true 90% of the time. Now, in both of these above examples, excessive violence was employed against the victims. And also, the HBO's, let me scroll up here, yeah. The HBO announcer made a telling point about the photo that it was taken of the bonfire of Mr. Brown's remains. Almost everyone was smiling. Smiles mean happiness, pleasure, and satisfaction. Such emotions suggest one reason for the 1,000 bullets in the bonfire. It was fun. The problem here is the announcer was wrong. The faces that shone out over HBO from the Omaha newspaper photograph was not smiling. Most showed no emotion. Now, the HBO announcer's error in describing the mob as smiling happily about their crime shows that many people that were recording and observing the incident instinctively bought into this stereotype that perpetrators are taking sadistic pleasure in the violence they commit against others. But unfortunately, we need a more nuanced explanation. Also, I just noticed there is a spider crawling across my computer screen. Give me a second. Excuse me, Mr. Spider. Could you please... Thank you. I will move you over there to my shelf. There we go. I don't want to hurt that spider. I quite like that spider. Whoops. Sorry, I scrolled the wrong screen. Now, first of all, to take the initial example of the men who murdered Mr. Brown, they felt they were justified. In their eyes, they were avenging the rape victim and showing that such behavior in their community would be punished without mercy. White mobs in the South were often motivated by a desire to keep the freed black population in their place, especially when it came to cases such as these. The role of the environment on mob lynchings is also worth accounting for. Now, this is very interesting. Baumeister claims... Whoops, sorry, I'm just going to pop up my screen. I forgot I set a timer for something again. This is the problem with me starting the stream. Where is it? Yes, here it is. This is research by Hovland and Sears. Yes, the role on the environment on mob lynchings in the South is also worth accounting for. Baumeister points out that when cotton prices were low, interracial violence was high. Conversely, high prices reduced outbreaks of violence. He also concludes this section by noting how since the early 1900s, the nature of racial crimes has completely reversed. With the FBI's reports, according to an FBI report on violence during 1993, black people were 4 times more likely than white people to commit hate crimes. Yep, we've reached that. That's you can definitely. I hope you can tell by now how people with strong political motivations on either side are going to find this book quite hard to get through. And I really do respect his ability to dig into this subject matter and remain objective about it. And this is where we get to the second example, which, as I remind you, is an example of a group of black men beating up a white person to the point of unconsciousness. Now, this is an interesting one because in the analysis, Baumeister immediately homes in on the fact that the black perpetrator fully admitted to feeling pleasure while harming his white victim. But even here, he says that there is nuance. Indeed, the exact same way the lynchers of William Brown felt they were keeping black people in their place, so too did the bicycle victims' attackers feel they were keeping white people in their place. In both cases, the motivation for violence had less to do with sadism and more to do with sending a message to a larger group that had minimal direct involvement with the events themselves. Let me actually just scroll out a little bit here and see how that, so I can fit more text on the screen. That actually works better, and you can still see more of it. Because the awkward thing that I was encountering was that my notes were getting ahead of what the actual page said. I think that works better, yes. This is very much a beta test of this whole concept, so I do apologize if there's a bit more scuff than usual. I will be able to refine this format considerably as we go forwards. Kenneth Patterson, I think that 95% of historical racism originates from competition for low-wage jobs where the outside/minority group is willing to work for lower wages. That is a very good analysis, and my best friend, who is an economist, would probably agree with you quite a lot. He does use the word scabs to describe those kind of people an awful lot, though, so I think you can take from that what his overall opinion on who should win that particular side is. But yeah, this comparison between the two sides is really very interesting, and it's another example of what really got me into this book. Now, other similarities, I'm on page, I need to go page 25. Now, other similarities include the mutual belief that the victims were responsible for the crimes of their entire race, aka the good old racial guilt argument, and both felt they had been provoked to action by larger forces. Baumeister states that when committing violent actions, perpetrators often feel completely justified and view their violence as a reasonable escalation in response to provocation by the victim or the victim's group. So on the one hand, we have a black man who was accused of raping white women, who was lynched by a white mob. In the latter case, we have a group of black youths attacking white people who they believe didn't show them the proper level of respect. And the whole respect argument is also very useful because this is when Baumeister brings egotism into the mix. Another feature of these two crimes concerns how people think of themselves, whether one uses the term pride, self-esteem, narcissism, or another. I do apologize if my voice gets a bit fast, by the way. It's because I'm getting into this. You saw Kurds complaining about Iraqi refugees in terms quite similar to how US complaints about illegals. I mean, there's that stone toss joke as well, where like that stone toss panel, which is the only person who hates a immigrant more than a white conservative, an illegal immigrant more than a white conservative is a legal immigrant with a job. It's like illegal immigrants do not want more illegal immigrants because the legal immigrants got there the hard way. They're not going to vote in favor of more illegal immigrants. But yeah. Now, this part on self-esteem and egotism I find particularly fascinating because Baumeister now brings egotism into the mix. He makes the claim that violent acts are most often perpetrated by those with high self-esteem, whether their favorable view of themselves is challenged by an external source or not. He brings this reality home to the viewer with the following quote: "If you are like most people, you will feel like lashing out at anyone who says you are not as great as you thought. The more inflated your self-esteem is, the more common such encounters are." Have I got that on screen properly? Yes, here it is, right here. That's the quote. The role of such vulnerable egotism is apparent in both these hate crimes. The mob wanted to teach black people a lesson about staying in their place. In a similar fashion, the black mob wanted to teach white people a lesson about staying in their place and to punish them for having treated black people with disrespect. Both mobs saw their victims as having made claims on status that were not permitted to them, as having been unfairly egotistical. The violence was meant partly as a way of putting the victims' fellows down, of teaching an apparently overdue lesson in humility. Now, to conclude this section, Baumeister revisits the parallels between the two examples one last time. First of all, he highlights the role of vulnerable egotism, and I've already read that part, so I won't go into it again. But in keeping with his enlightened centrist attitude of pissing off both sides of the political spectrum, Baumeister now takes a paragraph to explain his belief in the universality of in-group behaviors, pointing out that history suggests both black and white people have equal capacity to act with idiotic bigotry when given the opportunity. And as it quotes right here, as we will see, people almost universally form into groups and hold negative attitudes towards other competing groups. Groups are a vital part of human social life and are necessary for survival, but they also reflect a built-in predisposition towards a certain pattern of antagonism. We're nearly at the end here now, and I'm very happy with how this stream has gone so far. I will just check my timer for a moment. Yeah, 1 minute 30, that's excellent. Because I don't want these streams to drag on particularly long, as I do not like streaming for very long, honestly. But I think 2 hours is a pretty good point to hit. I will actually be going AFK for 1 moment here because I would quite like to go to the bathroom. So I will be just about 30 seconds or so. I'll be right back, chat. I have returned. Yeah, like the Englishman and the Irishman, or the Walesman and the Irishman, or the Irishman and the other Irishman. Yes, in-groups most definitely exist in pretty much every aspect of life. And although I remember, it's very interesting, actually, that apparently Caucasian white people have the lowest in-group preference of any racial group, whereas I believe that like African Americans and Indians and Chinese have like the highest in-group preference of all. In other words, an English person a Caucasian white on average has the least amount of interest in cohabiting with other white Caucasians. And meanwhile, somebody who is like a black African or a Chinese person has the highest level of preference for cohabiting with their own in-group as opposed to another group. Which is, of course, a factor that is ruthlessly exploited by modern-era progressives to try and dilute various parts of society by taking advantage of that fairly natural lack of an in-group preference. Magdalenus Rex, if I remember correctly, the culturally conditioned aversion to interbreeding usually made white people more inclusive. Yeah, that's actually a pretty good point, is that yeah, Catholicism has always had pretty strong incest laws, whereas, I mean, let's not even, it's literally a fact that groups like Indians and Pakistanis have really terrifying levels of inbreeding. There's several rather graphic documentaries on YouTube of the problems of cousin marriage and the products thereof that are a massive strain on Western health systems. So yeah, I mean, I'm not a Catholic, but yeah, at least they very much benefited from that part of observing the scriptures, put it that way. Yeah, it's really unpleasant. This documentary, it shows people. I thought Pakistanis are doing it alone. Indians do it too. It's a very inbred society, unfortunately, because pretty much any tribal society is very highly likely to have a very high level of inbreeding because they're trying to preserve it. Happened also in medieval Europe and other places like that. Basically, whenever your status depended on maintaining very strong intralineal family lines to keep as a possession of wealth, land, or status, inbreeding tended to be much more common. Whereas if marriage was for more practical reasons, like just have children and have them be productive, obviously a common farmer is not going to want to marry his sister because obviously even if for some reason they're going to live a happy life, they're not going to produce strong children. Whereas somebody who's playing Game of Thrones or Crusader Kings 2 or 3, they're perfectly fine with marrying their sister because that sister's going to have a really strong claim on the Holy Roman Empire, and that's what matters. And that's how you get abominations like Charles II. And I think Charles II was more interbred. He was more inbred than two direct pairings of father and daughter. Like if a father had incest with his daughter and that had a son, and then the son had incest with his mother and then produced a child, that was less inbred than Charles II. King Tut was obscenely inbred too. He was horribly inbred. Ada, it's even observed here in Latin America. Here where I live, there's an awful lot of cousin or second cousin marriage amongst the more rich people in order to give them money in the family. Yeah, it's exactly what happens, is that if there is a monetary external incentive for more incestuous pairings, then, well, people will find a way. Life will find a way. Or rather, life will find a way. It's just that it's not going to be a way that people want it to go. Anyway, let us move on from this delightful tangent about incest and move on to a delightful example of North Korean terrorism. I think that's a great way to segue out of this topic about incest. Let's segue from incest to terrorism. Yay! And this is another long example. I will leave this on screen if anybody wants to read, but this is the summary of this particular example. Hwan Hee was born into the beloved People's Republic of North Korea. Thanks to her father's connections, she grew up with a rare good education. After excelling at many different tests, she was chosen to become a special military agent for the Foreign Intelligence Service of North Korea. Her most important assignment was the Korean Air Flight 858 bombing, which she was told would be instrumental in preventing South Korea from hosting the 1988 Summer Olympic Games. She was promised many rewards for conducting this act of terrorism, but it was patriotic fervor and the desire to see her nation protected that served as her primary motivations. The attack itself was successful, causing the plane to crash and killing all aboard, but Hwan Hee herself was captured. After her capture, feelings of guilt and nightmares began to plague her life, including vivid scenes of her own family dying in the bombing. Thanks to these, she eventually confessed to her crimes at trial and was sentenced to death. However, this was later commuted to life imprisonment by the South Korean government. Actually, no, I think she was pardoned by the South Korean government. Wow. South Korea's justice system is a lot more delicate than you might have thought. That's pretty heavy. Terror. Is this the one about Kim Jong-un's brother? Unfortunately not. Unfortunately not. And I actually looked up the Korean Air Flight 858 bombing myself, doing a bit of research. She actually did, she tried to take cyanide capsules to kill herself after she was captured, but they were defective, and so she wasn't able to commit suicide, which I think is an interesting point, is that she was promised like a great deal of rewards and recognition, etc. and so on for this, but she was willing to try and commit suicide after she was put in danger. She and her handler. I see. Yeah, she is still alive today and has guilt to this day. I mean, it's a horrible situation, but I'm actually glad that she is alive and remorseful. Like, I don't think she should have been given the death penalty in this. Obviously, I wouldn't have pardoned her, but I wouldn't have given her the death penalty either. Magdalenus Rex, in my opinion, politics makes people evil. Democracy's trends towards making everything political, totalitarianism, is just the logical extreme of democracy. So democracy I'm not entirely sure how to interpret that arrow symbol that you put in your text. So democracy, totalitarianism allows evil. I mean, I'd overall agree. I very much dislike how political the modern world is, and I wish I could get away from it. It's been a consistent theme in my life that I have tried not to be political, and I attempt to be as neutral as possible, and yet, well, politics has a tendency to reach out and grab you anyway, and if you don't define yourself, you will be defined by somebody else. And I can say that I'm neutral as much as I like. I will still get branded as a right-wing radical by people who believe that all right-wing radicals will believe the kind of things that I do. Zuli, the European royal family, suddenly have nothing against inbreeding. Unfortunately not. But anyway, let's get back to this wonderful story. Now, Baumeister points to 3 important points about Hwan Hee's story. Now, the first is Hwan was initially focused entirely on the here and now details of the bombing plot. She gave no thought to the innocent lives she would be destroying. The second point was her horrific act of terrorism was committed in pursuit of what she saw as the highest of patriotic ideals. And 3, although she succeeded in her task, the expected results failed to materialize. Rather than score a great victory for the DPRK, all she did was become party to a meaningless act of state-sponsored mass murder. Which, of course, is highlighted here as well. The 1988 Olympics were held in Seoul anyway. Even more important, the reunification of Korea under North Korean leadership not only did not happen, but was in no way furthered by the bombing. The reunification looks less likely than ever. In operational terms, the mission succeeded. In terms of its basic political purpose, it was a complete failure. And Baumeister uses this example to show the general futility of violence when it comes to accomplishing long-term goals. The term necessary evil is often used to justify actions that are harsh and callous in the moment, but are supposedly rational when considered in the greater context of the greater objective. Unfortunately, Baumeister criticizes this approach, stating that the opposite is in fact true. Evil acts do not result in good outcomes, and a study of evil shows that this excuse is an inherently fallacious one. As he comments right here that I've highlighted the dark green text, violence is a relatively common means, but not a very effective one, especially when judged by its long-range consequences. Evil cannot be satisfactorily understood in terms of rational efforts to solve problems and pursue goals. And that's where the chapter ends, actually. Let me just have a sip of my water before I continue. And conveniently, I'm at the end of my bottle. And that is really the end of chapter 1, and I'm sure you can agree that it was a pretty good chapter. Let me just look at the comments now. Magnus Rex, communists called their actions necessary evil, but you can see the Bolsheviks / Red Guard / Khmer Rouge took a sadistic revelry in their crimes. There was no cold utilitarian stoicism in their action. Kenneth Patterson, there are no rational goals, only sporadically rational pursuit of irrational goals. I'm not entirely sure who I agree with that, Kenneth Patterson, but I can understand why you say that. Rin friend, everyone is so violent and irrational with politics. Can't find a girl my age that isn't a raging leftist useful idiot, so it's impossible to debate and share opinions properly. I mean, that's female solipsism is unfortunately extremely common, but that's a rant for another day. But yeah, that last example ties out the chapter, basically, and during this whole thing, we've seen 3 major examples. There's been the killing of William Brown, there's been Cody Brown, there has been also the mob violence between black and white people, and of course there has been this example of Hwan Hee, the bomber of the Korean, yes, which number, like 858, the KAL 858 flight. And I think this covers an awful lot of material, and to kind of conclude things, I do like what he highlights here at the end, that evil is the pattern of long-term pragmatic failure. Is that a lot of people think that have this idea that evil means justify a good outcome, that it's all right to be evil if your intentions are good and the outcome at the end is positive. You know, the ends justify the means. And I respect Baumeister a great deal in that he, throughout the chapters that I've already read, is very, very much against this concept that violent and evil means can result in good outcomes. And that is why I respect him quite a lot more than the average psychiatrist, because I found that many psychiatrists have a very literalistic and physical view of the world, in that they see actions, they don't factor in morality very much, or they view morality as a very empirical process, as in you are moral because the chemicals in your brain encourage you to be, that societal development is exclusively the result of basically apes bashing each other over the head until they learn the best ways to bash each other over the head, or the only reason that people are good to each other is because it makes society better in general, and so you're chemically programmed to be good to other people. You know, it's all this kind of vague chemical-based nonsense with a lot of psychiatrists, but I really do get the feeling that this guy right here, he understands the more spiritual aspects of evil and morality and positive behavior versus negative behavior in more than just the objective utilitarian values, which I massively appreciate and I massively respect. But overall, there's not a huge amount more for me to comment on. This has very much been a prototype for what I hope is going to be a whole series. I have already written out the whole of Chapter 2's notes, and I will I'm hoping to be at least 1 or 2 chapters in advance. There are... Allow me to just go back to the table of contents as well. In total, there are 12 chapters in this whole book. So there will be 12 separate streams. Each of these chapters is fairly self-contained and has its own examples and its own analyses. And in future chapters, I intend to have a bit more of a generalized statement as to round everything out, but this was my first crack at all of this. So I really hope that the people here enjoyed that. Zuli, I personally hate all politics, but have to pay attention to it because of how they screw the average person over just by how much is what really helps. See, I completely agree with you. I absolutely and totally agree with you. I try to avoid politics as much as possible. However, the difference between me and my parents is that my parents are neutral in terms of they don't vote and they don't go out and they don't engage in political activism. However, they overall have a somewhat leftist mentality, I would say, and they find the swing towards the right to be very disturbing and very upsetting, and they view that people are being irrational when they lean towards conservative-style politics, and they kind of view people that are more conservative as a bit strange and a bit weird and a bit unpleasant. And so they would have an instinctive bias against those kind of people. I, on the other hand, try and look at things as empirically as possible. I am very much... Again, I am a traditional Christian in a lot of ways. Therefore, a lot of conservative beliefs stem from beliefs in traditional Christianity. And so, again, I would not define myself as political, but if you gave me a political compass test, I would most definitely come out as fairly traditionally conservative. So, basically, my point is, I try to view everybody as empirically as possible, regardless of whether they're on my side, technically, or on the other side. And I also feel that people should be forgiven for acting in their own best interests, and it's important to understand people who are acting in their own best interests. There was a video by Unheard, a channel called Unheard, talking about the DEI industry recently, and essentially it was talking about it in terms of the rational incentives of people to push diversity, equity, and inclusion from a business perspective. And it was a very good video that I will maybe I'll link it in the chat. I'm not sure if I have a link to it right away, but I like videos like that because it underscored, it didn't just go, oh, DEI is bad and nobody should use it. It of course did say that because it's anti-DEI, but it was very sensibly looking at why people within the DEI industry felt they should push DEI and how they benefited from it. And when my parents look at people turning towards the right wing in Europe, their instinctive reaction is, these people are stupid, or these people are bigoted, or these people are in some way not adjusted right. So I don't like them. And in some cases, I would agree with them, because I think that turning towards the hardcore right wing, especially in Europe, is not the best idea, because a lot of these parties, a lot of these groups have pretty extremist viewpoints. They're not particularly competently run, and they don't have a good track record. However, I also acknowledge from the perspective of the individuals involved that they have been kicked around by the more liberal side of the system for years and years and years and years and years. And it is perfectly understandable how after all of that abuse, all of that suffering, and the collapse in living standards, the collapse in the economy, etc. and so on, why they would look at the other side and go, you know what, let's try those people for a while. And I think that kind of detached, objective analysis of the reasons why people do certain things, even if they are morally unpleasant to you, is incredibly important. Otherwise, all that will happen in life is that you will be dragged along by the morality that surrounds you. You will be chained by your own perception of good and evil, without actually ever understanding, ever being able to step outside yourself and looking at what is actually good and evil from an empirical perspective, which I genuinely do believe exists. And so, but not in the insane utilitarian way, where it's, dear, I hate that. Anyway, I have babbled on for far too long about this whole stuff. I really do appreciate everybody that's come tonight. I know that because the way that I've changed up my streaming time, and because of the way that I am not talking about VTuber stuff, I'm probably not going to get a huge CCV on all of this, and I'm not going to get too many viewers, but I actually enjoy this kind of content a lot more than talking about VTuber drama, so it is what I'm going to focus on for a while, and I really hope that I'm able to build up a bit of an audience doing it, and that I'm able to attract enough interesting people that I'm able to have some good discussions with them, because I don't consider my perspective to be universal in any of these cases. I do think that it's very important that people push back on me if they think that I'm saying something wrong, and that, well, I give as good as analysis as I can, but other people feel as if they have the ability to contribute as well. Yes, bye, Proctor. I am going to end stream now. Basically, he quoting, hell is full of good meanings, but heaven is full of good works. That's actually a pretty good quote. I'll have to remember that one. That's damn good, actually. Damn good, a quote about hell. Oh, dear. I found this quite entertaining. I can't wait for the next stream. Thanks, Proctor. The next stream should probably be a lot better, honestly, because this was just me kind of fumbling through things a lot with my first stab at this style of presentation. The next stream will definitely be a lot more organized and a lot more standardized. Maybe I'll even get some like cute backgrounds done or something, and a bit more visually interactive stuff. But I'm very glad that you enjoyed it, Mazuku1, and I hope to do much more of this. But for now, I will leave everybody. I will end stream here, and I will say goodnight to everybody. So I will, yeah, that's about it, really. It feels weird to end a stream and still feel fairly awake, because I'm used to ending stream in like 1 AM and being completely and totally exhausted. So this feels a bit odd. Anyway, good night, people. Thank you very much for coming. I will see you next week on Monday again. Thanks for the stream, Proctor. It's a good start. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I really do appreciate the positive feedback. It is very encouraging, because again, I know this is not something that everybody in my audience wants to see. But good night for now. I will see you all later. Goodbye.